So, first of all, thank you for showing up this morning. I think the entire town is still asleep. The subject we moved on to talk about was testing the Malthusian model. And that's what we're going to do in chapter 3 and 4 and 5 of the book, is to consider whether this very simple but very powerful model can really describe all of world history up until 1800. And I'll explain to you as we go along why that's a very controversial proposition and why there's still fierce debate about how we should interpret this pre-industrial world. And so the first thing that we're going to look at is just material living standards. And Wednesday, I showed you that, surprisingly, in England, where we can actually measure real wages, and by 1800, we're measuring all kinds of commodities that people are consuming. There's something like 50 or 60 different things that we can include in this measure. When we go back to 1200, it's down to 3 or 4 or 5 elements of consumption. But when we do that measure, we actually see, first of all, that there's no sign of any long-run upwards trend. The second thing we see, though, is that there's enormous variation, even in the past of this one small country, in terms of how well people lived. And that range of variation for agricultural workers is something like 3 to 1 between good periods and bad periods. And then the other thing that we see is that we can actually explain a lot of that variation in terms of the elements of the model. That the rocketing upwards of living standards is clearly associated with the onset of the Black Death, and that living standards are high precisely in the period when the Black Death is most vigorous and waging most strongly. And that actually is confirmation of the idea that the model is working. And then the second thing we see is that this relationship that the model depends on between population and living standards or wages is very nicely displayed in English data. Because it turns out that for England, again, because of this incredibly good data, we can roughly estimate the population all the way back to 1200. And when we get those estimates, we can then actually map out this curve of material living standards in the society and the population of England. And when we do that mapping, the population in the pre-industrial era is varying between 2 and 6 million. And what we find is that there's a nice curve that looks exactly like this, where the lowest living standards are found around 1300 when population is up here. And when population drops to almost as low as 2 million in 1450, we're down here. And the rest of the period, this early period, it just lies between these two extremes. And it maps out very nicely exactly that relationship of the model. And we only break away here in terms of the model around about 1650, away from this stable relationship that exists all the way from about 1200 till about 1650. And that's about 400 years. And what that implies is that in England, between about 1200 and 1650, there's no sign of any technological advance. That the economy is just stuck in this world where living standards go up or down just depending on population. And you've got this one kind of fixed possibilities schedule here. And there's no sign of that shifting out all the way in this early period. And so again, as I say, it's very nice confirmation of one of the basic ideas of the model, that the problem in the pre-industrial world is that you're stuck with this relatively immobile trade-off between wages and population. And then what happens is after 1650, we start heading up this way. But the interesting thing is that from 1650 up until 1800, you'll see that the movement is largely vertical. That is, that there is now evidence of better technology, right? That this production possibilities schedule here is actually moving outwards in this period. But that what's happening is that most of that movement is being absorbed not in income, but in population growth. Okay? And that's another element of the model, the idea that technological advance in the pre-industrial world largely simply increases population. It doesn't, in the long run, increase incomes. And so England itself, as I say, within this very nice data, actually in the gross level here, seems to confirm a lot of elements of the Malthusian model from 1200 to 1800. Okay? Now, as I say, there are very few other countries where we can get this kind of good wage data going a long way back. Other ones would be the Netherlands, now Italy as well. There's some nice studies. One of the interesting things that actually emerges here is I mentioned that in 1450, the English have wages that are very, very high. And they're even high, we'll see, by modern, underdeveloped country standards. The evidence, though, from Italy suggests the Italians were even richer around about 1450. That England in that period was actually a relatively poor economy. And that if you go to somewhere like Italy, living standards are even higher in this medieval period than they are in England. And by the way, I always like to give some practical advice when we're talking about the history of the world before 1800. But if there was a theory of tourism, the question is, why are some parts of the world, like Ohio, very dull to visit, but other parts of the world, like northern Italy, are just full of interesting buildings and cathedrals and town halls? And the answer is that one of the things that makes for a very interesting area to visit is it has to be a society that was rich in the past, and only rich people produce big monuments, fine art, all of these other things. And then what has to happen to the society is it has to get poor for a while, because if you have a rich society in the past but it keeps getting richer, then what will happen is tastes change all the time, and they tear down all of the old stuff and replace it with something newer. But the places that survive as these interesting, with artifacts from thousands of years ago, it has to be places, first of all, that were rich early on, but that secondly, then went into a period of economic decline so that they couldn't afford to redo the Gothic cathedrals, now with neoclassical cathedrals followed by concrete monstrosities. And so there is actually this kind of interesting, and also it turns out that that's also important to the survival of records, because it tends to be, in England, the places that have the best records are ones that were rich, but later got somewhat poorer, because then they don't rebuild the town hall and in process clean out all the records, because now you're moving from one building to the next building. And you can actually go to towns in Northern England and ask the archivist, what about the wage records from the Middle Ages? And they say, well, we had those till 1900. Then we changed the town hall and we threw out everything that seemed irrelevant from the past. Okay? And so, as I say, England has this nice aspect. We can see all of this history play out. And as I say, in the gross level here, it seems to validate the Malthusian model. What else can we say just before we move on from England? Because we've got such good data from England, we can actually compare their living standards to living standards around the world now. And in the book, what we'll see is we take one country in Africa, Malawi, where we have relatively good measures of wages for the year 2001 to 2. And we can compare that to, well, what are Malawian wages now compared to the wages of workers in England in 1800? And the answer is that the Malawians now earn about 40% of what people did in England in 1800. That there are still in the world very, very poor societies. And what we're also going to see is that the English in 1800 are no better off than the hunter-gatherers. So that actually has the clear implication that there are now a whole group of nations, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, who are probably poorer than the average person who lived in the world before 1800. And that actually creates a very interesting puzzle, which is we've had 200 years of technological advance, of dramatic improvements in technological possibilities. how can it be that there are some societies that seem to have got poorer in response to that advance as opposed to getting dramatically richer? Because we'll also see that the evidence for Africa is that it wasn't that poor around about 1800, that it's quite likely that a bunch of those African nations are now poorer than they were before the onset of modern technology. And that's a kind of interesting puzzle, because how is it now when these countries now, you have cell phones in places like Malawi, you have texting, right? But you have living standards that are still below those of the pre-industrial world. What can produce that kind of outcome? And that's to say, when we go on and talk about the sources of economic growth, we'll see that that's one of the puzzles about economic growth, which is that it seems to have something to do more than just with the technology that societies have available to them. The second thing we can actually say is that Malawi is not the poorest measured economy in the world at present. And so if you look at income levels, there's a standard international survey of income levels. There are some doubts when you see these numbers that they can really be correct, because according to those numbers, Tanzania, around about the year 2000, had living standards that were 1/5 those of England in 1800, and which by implication would say that Tanzania was dramatically poorer than the average hunter-gatherer society, right? And so when I see, I mean, these are the standard numbers that are reported, but I must say some of them are so low in the modern world when you compare them to these pre-industrial world that it just seems incredible. And remember, England in 1800 is at less than, it's only about 2/3 of the living standards of England in 1450, right? And so there were some, and we'll see that we can find other societies that seem to be even richer in this pre-industrial period, right? And that emphasizes a kind of a second idea of this model, which is when we say that there's a subsistence income in these pre-industrial societies, it doesn't mean a starvation level income, right? It means simply an income that balances births and deaths in these early societies. And what we're going to see is that income level can actually be astonishingly high in the pre-industrial world. Human populations are not all driven to a kind of grim Malthusian past where you're living on the edge of starvation. You can actually, with the right circumstances, live very well in this pre-industrial world. And actually, one of the things that is interesting about Africa in the last 50 years is that just like in England here, you can actually trace out that there has actually been technological advance in those African economies. But again, for a lot of them, it's all been absorbed in enormous rates of population growth. And population has tripled or quadrupled in many of these economies. They're very fast rates of population growth by any standards. And it looks just like pre-industrial England when you first had technological advance, that it's just getting eaten up in providing more and more people within these economies. And so again, as I say, in 1800 England, we find these countries are dramatically poorer. What are countries that are roughly at the same living standard in the modern world as England in 1800? It turns out that it's Pakistan is a little bit poorer. India is somewhat richer. But even modern India, which we think of now as a kind of a growing country, as a potential leading economy in the world in future, it's still not that much above the standards of England in 1800, and it's still probably not even above the standards of, not at all above the standards of England in 1450, okay? And so that's really one thing you've got to take on board, is this idea that living standards are restricted in the Malthusian world, but they're not necessarily particularly low. To do a wider comparison of living standards in the past, we can't use these comprehensive wage measures. And so to do a wider comparison, what we're just going to look at is what we're going to call the wheat wage. And so we're going to look at just one commodity, wheat or its equivalent, and simply ask, across various societies, how many pounds of wheat does the wage buy? Okay? And as I say, it's a very imperfect measure because the relative price of grains to other commodities can change quite dramatically in societies. People didn't just consume wheat. They consumed clothing, they consumed alcohol, they consumed housing, and so it's a very imperfect measure. But the trouble is, for a lot of societies, we only get the prices of a few commodities. And in this early world, in a lot of societies, 70%, 60% of people's income will actually be spent on the equivalent of wheat. So you are actually measuring probably the biggest component in people's incomes. But it's still a pretty restricted measure. But we can actually get that measure across a kind of a huge range of societies. And the first thing you need to understand is that a pound of wheat is equal to about 1,500 kilocalories. So just to get an idea of what this metric means. And a reasonably well-nourished male in the pre-industrial world would need at least 2,000, 2,500 kilocalories. In fact, agricultural workers needed more food because, unlike us, they don't sit around all of their time and they don't operate as ghosts in machines. So that in some pre-industrial agricultural societies, we can actually observe agricultural workers consuming 5,000 or 6,000 calories a day, right? Because if you're doing a lot of physical work, you need the fuel for that work. But a reasonable consumption standard would demand for a male and adult male somewhere around 2,000, 2,500 kilocalories per day. Okay? And remember, you don't work every day of the year typically in these societies. And so what we think of is that for reasonable consumption level, you need to get a wage of at least, just for yourself, the equivalent of 2 pounds of wheat, right? But then, remember, male workers have children, they have other dependents that they're supporting. There are a lot of women work in poor societies. And so the minimum in order just to feed the population is going to be something more like 4 pounds of wheat per day, right? With that, you can pretty much get by, right? But it can't fall much below that. That's really, you're getting down towards the kind of the biological minimum at that point. So what's the record then in terms of the pre-industrial world? England in 1800, the agricultural wage is, or the laborer's wage in towns is around about the equivalent of 12 pounds of wheat. Okay? And so that's why, as I say, you're well above that kind of physical subsistence limit, right? There's a lot of potential surplus for people's consumption here. Now, this measure is actually discriminates against England in this period because by 1800, England had already had a lot of population growth. Population is growing quite rapidly as we're moving into the Industrial Revolution period. It's a small island. It has not a lot of land. And by 1800, it's starting to import large quantities of food. But there are these import restrictions. There's the corn laws that limit the ability to import food. And what it means is that food prices are relatively high in England. It turns out a lot of other prices like clothing, industrial goods are actually very cheap in England in this period. And so this measure kind of underestimates the living potential of a place like England compared to, say, Poland in Eastern Europe, where food is extraordinarily cheap. So what does it look like if we go into the ancient past? And so we can actually get these measures for ancient Babylonia. Sorry, Babylonia. Spelling. Okay. For 1700 BC. So that's about 3,500 years before the onset of modern growth. And that's about the earliest society we can actually get measures of both wages and also measures of wheat prices. And in ancient Babylonia, it's not wheat. Barley is the staple good of consumption. But we know how many calories there are in barley, how many calories there are in wheat, and so we can calculate the equivalence in terms of wheat. Okay? And the answer is that the ancient Babylonian worker got the equivalent of about 15 pounds of wheat. So they're actually at least as well off as English workers 3,500 years later. Okay? By the way, why do we know so much about ancient Babylonian? It's because their writing system was on clay tablets. And they kept elaborate records. It's amazing. I mean, it's a world where that's how you write things. And you can fire the tablets to preserve the records. But for ordinary transactions, commercial transactions, it was all done on lumps of clay. They even had clay envelopes that they could put the tablets in so that if you had a private correspondence, you could actually send it to someone, they break this envelope, and then inside is the actual information, right? And one of the things about that is that, two things, it can survive over very long periods. The other thing is that when cities were attacked in places like Persia or Babylonia, which were using this writing system, often they were set fire to by the marauders after they'd looted the cities. That fires the clay in the clay tablets. It hardens the record, and then it's just left in the ruins, and you actually get this process of destruction often actually creates very durable records from this early period. And so that's why there's actually a large, large collection of these tablets. And there's so many of them that historians really haven't been able to work through all of this material because there's just so much that survives from this early society. And so that's why you'll see a lot about ancient Babylonia if you go back to very early societies, just because of this peculiarity of the writing system. When it comes out that for ancient Rome, we have much less good information. We actually have a huge paucity of economic information for the European part of ancient Rome. Why is that? It's because the Roman writing system was based on wax tablets that they would write on. They don't survive. And actually, often they're reused then. And so that we get very, very fragmentary information. A lot of information from ancient Rome comes from things that are carved on stone monuments. There's very little written material. There is one collection of documents that they have, one very significant collection, which was that for more formal writing, they would write on papyrus rolls. And those are more durable, but in Northern Europe still, it's very hard for those to survive. But with the eruption of Vesuvius, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in volcanic ash, it turns out that there's a villa which had a huge library in Herculaneum, which was full of these rolls. But the only problem was they were all burned to a black crisp by the pyroclastic flow that went through. And when the initial excavators found this villa, they actually thought that this stuff was some kind of early form of coal. And they actually used the papyrus that they'd found to light the underground workings, thinking that it was some kind of fuel, right? Because it's all black and crispy. And only quickly, fortunately, they discovered that, hold on, there's something in the center of this coal, it's the center of the thing, the spindle around which it's wrapped. But it's very hard to unwrap it then because it's all crispy. And so for whatever reasons, though, they kept this stuff. And so they have this in the museums, all of this black, unreadable fragments of material. Now, though, advances in CIA detection technology make it possible to shine light at certain wavelengths on that stuff and actually see the underlying writing. And so what you actually then find is now it's readable, right? And now we've got this large collection. The only trouble is, though, it's all philosophical text, right? It's like getting the musings of, I don't know, the Est group in Santa Monica, or whatever, about how to live the good life, right? And so far, it doesn't tell us anything about the economic life, right? Because this is the high philosophy of the society that they were preserving in this villa. It's not what we need for economic history is the stuff that people typically throw out, which is your grocery receipt or your wage bill or other stuff like that, right? And so there is a whole interesting kind of history that also about how do we know about some societies but not about others. And you'll see that actually turns out amazingly, ancient Rome is one where we know very little about the economic life or living standards in that society because of these oddities about what people wrote on and what gets preserved. So ancient Babylonia then, very good. The other early society that we get some information from is classical Athens. And that information is from around about 350 BC. And here, what we're dependent on, question over here.
Yeah, I was just curious, when you talk about like the wages to the poor, 15 pounds and 12 pounds, is that like for a month period of time?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the question here is, well, what are you meaning by this wage? I should have made it clear. This is the day wage, right? This is the wage, the equivalent of a day's labor, right? How much you would get with that wage, right? And so the important thing to calibrate that is you need about maybe 2 pounds for kind of minimum subsistence for the man himself. This is male wages. For since in all of these societies people have dependents, you need a minimum of about 4 pounds to just be at the kind of the physical subsistence level in these societies, right? And the important thing is England in 1800 is well above that level, right? That's why it's possible for modern Malawian wages to be 40% of those in England in this period, because Malawians are actually living close to that physical subsistence level, right? This surprising thing then is if you go to ancient Babylonia, they're at 15 pounds, right? The next thing, as I say, we get fragmentary information here, is classical Athens, 350 BC. Here, what we're depending on are people would give money for temples to honor the gods. The people in the temple, to show that they spent the money wisely, chiseled onto the walls of some of these temples, here's how we spent the money in constructing the temple. We had so many workers, we paid them so much a day, right? And we had this other video, we had this other piece of information. And so it's actually, we're relying on those carvings that are on the walls. The amount of information for classical Athens, again, is surprisingly limited. So that, and a lot of it's been known for a long time, so that the Packard family, I believe, paid for a project where they put every fragment of Greek writing is on 2 CDs. And you can actually, if you're studying in that area, you can order the CDs, and then you've got the entire collection of everything that's been written, that we know that was written in the ancient Greek world. And it's added to periodically. I mean, there are no new discoveries, but it's surprisingly limited. But that's why all we can get here is just a few fragments of information. And here's the astonishing thing. That day wage of the building laborers, just the unskilled laborers in classical Athens, is about 27 pounds of wheat per day, which would make them, even by modern standards, relatively wealthy in this society. But as I say, it's really just a very minor fragment that we're getting here. And then the other society that we do have some information from is actually Roman Egypt. So Egypt was taken over by the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC, and then was part of the Roman Empire for the next at least 300, 400 years. And the reason we have records from there is because the climate in Egypt is extremely dry. It's a desert country, essentially. And what happened there is that papyrus in those conditions can actually survive thousands of years. And then the other interesting oddity there is that in this world, there was a cult which worshipped crocodiles, and which would bury embalmed crocodiles. And so that they can find many of these embalmed crocodiles in mausoleums and cemeteries in ancient Egypt. But in the embalming process, they need to wrap the body. What they would use is used commercial papyrus. And so you can unwrap these crocodiles and find just random pieces of commercial information. And again, you actually get some more information from the society in this way. There's another interesting oddity in Cairo. There was a very active Jewish trading community. And this is somewhat later, so this is in the Middle Ages. They had a storeroom in the synagogue where, and I'm going to be on shaky ground theologically here, but I believe that certain types of documents could not be, for theological reasons, destroyed. They had to be put in this storeroom. And a lot of that's actually commercial correspondence. And so that they had this whole storeroom which just sat there with all of this used commercial correspondence sitting there. And now you can go back and actually translate all of that. And because of the climate again, this stuff would actually survive through 1,000 years in this case. And so Roman Egypt, as I say, we get some information. Here, this is for about 250 AD. And the implied wheat wage is about 8 pounds of wheat per day. And so what you actually see, and I give some more examples in the book, is that there's nothing in that data that suggests that, you know, England is rich relative to most of the pre-industrial world. What you actually see again is this pattern of a lot of variation across societies. A lot of this is just going to be caused by error, right? We have very poor measures of wheat prices. We have very poor measures of wages. Workers may receive something else in addition to the money wage. But the general story is that wages could be pretty high in this pre-industrial world, and there's no sign that somehow England is any better off than these earlier societies. So that's the first thing, looking into the past. The next thing we can ask is, what about 1800? We can actually do a tour of the world in 1800, and we're going to see some very kind of surprising, interesting things. But where we'll take England as a baseline and then say, where are the poorer parts of the world than England measured in terms of these wheat wages? Where are the richer parts? And so if we put England then in the middle here, and depending on which group exactly you measure the day wage with, it's going to be about 11 to 13 pounds, right? And so we're looking at societies as close to 1800 as we can get, as close to the end of the Malthusian era. What does it look like across the world? And so going downwards from England, here's China. The equivalent to the wheat wage is about 6.6 pounds. Now, parts of China consume wheat in the north. Most of China consumes rice. So this is actually a translation between the calories in rice into the calories in wheat. Okay? And not all calories are the same, right? So for example, if you translate from potatoes to wheat, potatoes people don't like as much as wheat. And so, you know, that translation would kind of underestimate. I mean, some grains are better than others. But this is assuming that rice is as tasty and as pleasant for people to eat as bread is, right, as wheat is. And if you do that translation, what you find is that China seems to be about at half the living standards of England in this period. And this is what is actually going to be part of a general interesting pattern, which is living standards in Asia seem to be very low relative to those in Europe and the Middle East in the world around 1800. There seems to be this very significant difference between the living standards of the East and the West in this period. And some people, some scholars, have wanted to argue that that's going to be the reason why the Industrial Revolution is occurring in the West, that it's a reflection of some process which is actually driving up living standards, which is pointing out that there's something better economically about these societies, and that we can find the roots of the Industrial Revolution long before 1800, and that's why, you know, you're getting this divergence in fortunes, right? What we're going to insist is that this has nothing to do with technology, and it's all to do with fertility, mortality, and it doesn't reflect any advantage that the West has in technological terms in this period. Question?
So for which time period is that?
Sorry, this is all about 1800, right? Now, as I say, the other thing that's interesting here is that Chinese evidence is extremely fragmentary. It's based, again, on very small pieces of evidence. I don't know, I'm not sufficient knowledgeable about Asia to know, is this simply because we haven't had the armies of scholars march into China yet and dig through all of the various archives, as we have in somewhere like England, or whether this actually reflects the fact that somehow records didn't get preserved very well in China. And that's actually interesting. That can sometimes also tell you something about the sophistication of the economy of a society, is how much do records actually survive and get preserved. So China is here at 6.6 pounds. We also have Korea. It's very similar. And then we actually have Milan in Italy by then was down to 5.6 pounds. And so there are actually some parts of Europe, and this is southern Europe, which don't look that different from Asia by this period. And remember, that's interesting because in the Milan is in North Italy. That seems to have been an enormously rich society back in the Middle Ages. And so what you're actually seeing in the case of Italy, I mentioned, this is the point, Italy became very poor, right? And that's why a lot of that stuff survived in northern Italy. It was because of the decline in the economy of the society, right? Wages in Milan in the high medieval, the late medieval period would be 3 or 4 times what this wage is here. And then we also get some information from India. And again, this is all based on rice being translated into the equivalents in wheat. It's down at 5.1 pounds around about 1800. These are very poor societies, right? And then last of all, right at the bottom here is Japan. And the equivalent of the wage in Japan is 4.5 pounds. And what's interesting is Japan has actually quite good records. Japan actually has reasonably good information on prices and wages in this period. And that's why we can be more confident of that figure with Japan. But what you can see is there's this huge difference between England and Japan on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And what's interesting about that is Japan, in many other ways, is a very sophisticated society in this period, right? And on many ways, it is not far behind England in terms, it is a bit behind, but not far behind England in terms of the level of sophistication of the society, the technology. And yet, it has these incredibly low wages. Okay? And what I'm going to show you is evidence on heights, and it strongly confirms this idea that Japan is somehow uniquely poor amongst, it's the poorest society we can observe in the pre-industrial world, right? And I'd say it's kind of interesting, it's not a competition you want to come first in, which is who's going to be the poorest society. But it's also what we're going to find interesting is it actually had life expectancy that was as good as England in this period, right? Despite these incredibly low wages, Japanese actually are relatively healthy in the pre-industrial period, but they really seem to be pushing towards this kind of physical subsistence margin in this period. And I'd say it's a puzzle. This is still an area of a lot of debate about how does the West compare to the East on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. But once you start seeing you can see a kind of systematic pattern emerging here. There may be a lot of errors in individual observations, but there's a consistency here. So that's one side of the divide with England. We can go on the other side and say, what are the rich places in the world compared to England in this period? And one of the richest cities is Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where the wage is the equivalent of about 21 pounds of wheat. Okay? And so that's actually very high compared to England. Now, there's a problem here, though, which is that big cities, this is true of the modern world, it's true of the ancient world, big cities tend to have relatively high wage levels because there are other cost-living cities. And remember, I mentioned that a city like London has a very bad disease environment. And so part of it may be that people are saying, I'm not going to go to the city unless I get compensated for these other elements there. And so if you actually took London itself as opposed to England as a whole, the wage in London in terms of wheat would be 16 pounds, right? And so that there's going to be a difference between average and these cities, big cities, in terms of wage levels. But Amsterdam, as I say, is up here at 21 pounds. Let me just give a few other examples. One of them is Istanbul, which is Constantinople, right? Which was the center of the Byzantine Empire for many years, and then of the Ottoman Empire. Its wage around about 1800 is 18 pounds, right? Now remember again, Istanbul is a big city, right? It just happens that that's where we get that information. But the implication is that it's at least as well off as London in this period, okay? What else is doing well? Cairo, again, a big city. These are building workers, laborers' wages, about 15 pounds. But you can see that there are actually, these are surprisingly rich societies compared to places like Japan, right? I mean, that there really is this interesting variation across the world where it's both Northern Europe and it turns out also for some reason the Middle East are wealthy. Asia, typically very poor. And then one other society here is Warsaw, capital of Poland, which actually has, again, measured in terms of wheat, relatively high wages. But the thing that I have to point out is just that this reflects the limitations of this measure, right? Poland is actually quite poor as a society in this period, but Poland was a major producer of grains. That was the main economic activity in Poland. That grain was shipped out. It's the grain that's feeding people in Amsterdam in this period. And because they're the producer, this grain has to be taken from the interior of Poland to the coast. They have a terrible transportation system. It means that the cost at point of origin is actually quite low because there's a lot of value added going on in terms of getting it to the ports. The way they would actually get the grain from the interior of Poland in this period to the ports is they would build ships, load them up just with heaps of grain, and float them down the rivers to the Baltic. And the grain would be just exposed to the elements and would actually start to sprout. And so at the end, you have a carpet of growing grain on top of it. They would just pull that off. Underneath, there's other grain that's still good. And then it gets put on ships in the Baltic. And the rafts that they built to float it down, they would just break up for fuel or for timber when it got to the Baltic. And so this is a primitive economy at this time. And so on that wheat measure, it's going to seem a lot richer than someone like England. But if you looked at much more comprehensive measures, if you looked at clothing, all of these other things, that's the English would seem rich. And so that's why, I say, there's an important limitation in this measure. It's looking just at one aspect of consumption. And we can back that up, though, by looking at things like heights. We're going to talk about what heights can tell us. And also we can look at the pattern of consumption. Because very poor societies have a very characteristic pattern of consumption, which is as people get poorer and poorer, they start going in hunt of the cheapest form of calories, right? And it's amazing. I mean, the human body can adapt, and it'll figure out, if I really don't have a lot, the priority is to get calories, right? And you will then consume just foods that are very cheap in terms of their calorie content. And then as people get richer, there's a very clear pattern in terms of where their consumption tends to head, right? And it turns out that we'll see that it's quite easy to predict a lot about what future human societies are going to look like. Because if economic growth continues in the modern world, we're all going to get richer, right? We're going to steadily get richer. But we already have a lot of rich people in our society. We can look at, well, what do they consume, right? How do they live their lives? This is going to be the guide as to where we're all headed, right? Now, there's going to be changes in relative prices that may significantly affect that. But it's interesting that it's quite possible to predict, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, what the likely patterns of consumption are, right? And that's one reason why those who are worried about global warming know that we're all doomed if this really is a problem. Because we know what patterns of energy consumption are as people get richer. And what it says is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to kind of rein in energy output because of the path that societies are destined to take as energy consumption goes up. And again, with automobiles, we know in terms of automobile usage that it's very strongly positively associated with higher levels of income. And that again, we can see where the world is headed in these terms. Okay? So that's a good point to stop. What we'll do next time is just continue with chapter 3 in terms of looking then at other measures of living standards around the world in this period. Thank you. Have a good weekend.